Hello, everyone, and welcome to another GoMobi.work weekly people development workshop, where every week we are bringing you a topic in leadership and performance development that you can bring back for your team to help everyone that you work with grow and show up as their best self. And today we are joined by a very special guest, Elaine Chung. Elaine is the founder of My Playtype, and she's a play expert. And we are already having such a good time on this call that we are forcing ourselves to hit record so we capture some of this magic that is happening already. But we're really excited to have Elaine here with us today. We're going to be talking a lot about how we can bring some new attitudes to our company culture and our leadership tactics to create the transformation that we really want and to make it last. That's another thing that we've been talking about. So, Elaine, thank you for being here with us.
Well, thanks, Wade. It's been fun.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. So, right before we got started, we've been talking about a handful of things already, but I wanted to start off with if you could just tell our audience and the leaders that are watching this, what is it that brought you to your journey with play? And I think you have such an interesting origin story, so I would love for you to share that with the crowd.
Thanks. Well, it all started on a long quest. Actually, like with my kids. We did cross-country flight, and I had twins, 1.5 at the time. And I thought, be the mom that looks up for different activities that don't require screens. And I had lots of activities, but that cross-country flight, like I had one kid who played with something for 20 minutes, which is a long time for a 1.5-year-old, and then another kid that played like 5 seconds for it. And it started with my question of like, why? Why is it that they're the same age? They're twins. Like, why is it that one played with something longer than another? And that curiosity just fostered into more of like, all right, like understanding the research with my day
Mm,
job and like the work that I did in the digital health
mhm.
space. And I was so comfortable like going straight into the clinical papers and calling up the researchers and asking them questions, and started to piece together all this like brain development, play side of it, personality development. And that just continued to evolve with, at the core of it, inspiration from kids around play and how leadership, we can learn things about leadership, we can learn things about how different ways to think about things, but also how to find our thrive area. Kids have a specific play zone, that the sweet spot where they can lose track of time and play. And during the
Mhm.
pandemic, I was coaching organizations and their employees on like, how do you find your kid's sweet spot? Because at the time with the pandemic, like we're trying to work at home, and yeah, and like trying to get
Tight
stuff done
quarters.
with
Yeah,
kids there too. And
right.
it the same goes with people. Like there are areas where we also can lose track of time, whether it be within an Excel sheet, to like, so there are elements of it that we can identify with work, which is, at the end of the day too, like when we want to spend a little more time in our thrive area,
Yeah.
and likely when you're in those zones, you feel satisfaction, inquiry, and likely joy. And so here
Yes.
really to spread the word and the learnings on like how that neuroscience of play can really
Yeah.
help invigorate that and really bring joy back into the workplace.
Oh my God, I could not agree more. This is the thing that I wake up every single day thinking about, and this is what we think about every one of these talks is ultimately coming back to that very point, which is how can we make, and I think anybody that you talk to is like, I would like to find as much joy in my work as possible. And too many people, unfortunately, are like, work is something that I do, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with having a job that you don't feel super joyful at, as long as you can find maybe joy in other things and your job is the thing that pays the bills. But what we're finding is that so many organizations that do create a space where people are enjoying their work, they actually are able to get way more stuff done. So I'm curious if that was something that like lit up in your head right away that this could be applied to work, or was it
Yeah.
just that you were like one day after doing it for a while, the light bulb went off?
Well, no, like, yeah, I think as a working mom, like I saw how like when I brought that attitude or that
Mm-hmm.
viewpoint of inquiry into the workplace, and when I touched on the Excel sheet, like I'm one of those, like I can get lost in the Excel sheet, like trying to
Me too.
program, like yeah, getting lost in like, all right, like what trigger points within that would create this, and
Mm-hmm.
okay, what do I have to look up and explore, and allowing for that some rabbit hole time to like explore, investigate, like that was fun.
Yeah.
And so I think, yes, like I saw areas where it's like, oh yeah, like if I can create more of those moments, I am more satisfied. I am also more productive. And if
Yep.
it's great when you can match it up with what the company needs, like within that. So when as I continued the career and
Mhm.
being more on the management side of it, you can see where you can tap into that. So it's like a plus plus, like you're able to tap into that as an organization, to utilize those skill sets, but tap into it in a way that actually helps empower that employee, helps them thrive more, and
Yes.
be in that zone of flow and creativity. And and at the end of the day, it's like we are solving hard problems, we still want some outcomes, but you're able to
Yeah.
funnel that. Like there's much more power in funneling that than like drudging something in the mud of someone who's like not wanting to do. And I think I'm not saying that, we all just need to find the thrive area and just stay there.
Yeah.
There's growth areas too, right? Like, so within
Mhm.
that, so, but having that mix in at least an environment that accepts like that there are those zones that we can all tap into, the thrive
Mhm.
area, that can be really beneficial for an organization and like an individual's like mental health, satisfaction with job, loyalty too. Like that's been harder and harder as the years have gone on, in companies, and that can be a great asset.
I love it. So I have a two-part question. So
Mhm.
I love the talk of thrive areas. I think this is such it's a thing that we all kind of have an understanding, like maybe this is what if I'm aware that I do this best. We've talked about this before. It's like your known knowns or your known strengths. So this is what I am sure that I do well, but there are also the known unknowns. So like the things that you're like, I'm not so good at that yet. I'm still developing. And the things that are the danger zone are the unknown unknowns. So when you think about the thrive zone, how do you think about coaching people into discovering what their thrive zones are, and then as the opposite of that, what do you think are some, in your experience, what are some of the things that get in the way of organizations putting people in the right position to get into those thrive zones? Because that's
Mhm.
one of the things we think about a lot too.
Yeah, no, so like the first part, like finding that thrive zone, you're right. It's really hard to look introspectively,
Hmm.
and like, oh, I wonder where I thrive in. That's a hard question to ask. So I always position of like, where do you feel at your best, and even where do you lose track of time? Because that is
Okay.
actually a measure, like for kids, like some will, if they are really into
Uh-huh.
Legos, building Legos, you can be hours. It could be hours, and they like
That was
you won't
me.
hear a thing. There you go. See, so I feel like we all as adults too have areas where it's like, oh my gosh, like I didn't even know I just spent 3 hours doing that.
Yeah.
And first recognizing that likely then like you were in a complete flow state. So there's that
Hmm.
level of challenge and familiarity. That's that right balance. And pausing to then dissect. So I would say on a play standpoint, be a kid, in like observation and understanding, and take on ethology, which is like Jane Goodall like made observations. So think back at those times where you were at your best, where you were in that thrive zone, and start asking yourself, all right, what was I doing? Was I
Hmm.
touching anything? Was I talking instead? Who was around me? What was I really talking about? What was I energized about talking about? And you'll
Right.
start to piece together like these elements of like, okay, like I have to be walking around doing workshopping because I like to move my body and having those conversations. Like you can start really
Mm.
identifying, like a scientist, like kids are natural scientists, really observing those factors. And then once you recognize it, then it's like, all right, then I need to identify where else in the like organization or in my life that I can have those elements to it,
Hmm.
to increase the number of times you're in that zone. So that's where
Yeah.
I would like, that's how like some of that introspection is like, all right, turn that scientific question. Let's like, all right, first feel it, feel that it's
Yeah.
different, and
Totally.
then start piece together. And you may not know it all the time, but like again, like if you have some body reaction, you're like, oh,
Yeah.
okay, like just take a moment to pull it in and like start asking some questions.
Oh, it's such a good one. And then one of the things that we find in a lot of work that we've done is that organizations sometimes get stuck in these really rigid ways of doing what they do. And that can be a major problem for getting people into the Thrive Zone. Is there anything in your experience, like if you were to go into an organization tomorrow and you hadn't been there, haven't been there before, but you know that like they want to achieve this outcome of helping people do really good work and be happy while they do it. What are some of the first things, the first modifications that you think about?
Yeah. I think the first one is like what I've been calling like constructs of constraints that exist. And
Hmm.
there are ones that an organization may hear of, but there are likely many others that they don't even know, like leaders don't know. And I like using the example of like kids, of course. So my kids playing in the mud, they're using different tools, and I still have this video because it just gives me good reminders. And right in the middle of their play, my daughter like looks at her nails and is like, "Oh, we got to go wash our hands." And so that right there is like a parental construct of constraint. Like my constraint that I applied to her just by saying like, "Oh, got to wash your hands, dirty hands," like constantly,
Oh, wow.
small micro moment, but it stopped her in her flow, in her play. Right.
Uh-huh.
So when you think about that and extract it and think about how, like, how many times as leaders had we done some micro moment that actually caused a mental constraint on our
Yep.
employees or our team
Yeah.
members, right? And we don't even recognize that. So I think that's the first part is peeling back, and that is talking with those team members that are
Yep.
integral to what they're trying to shape, into
Mhm.
identifying like what are the existing constructs of constraints, like the belief systems that are already
Yeah.
set. And some of them are organizational, some of them are more like cultural, societal,
Mhm.
that all get baked into it because I think as organizations get advanced, it can be easily forgotten that the organization is still living, breathing of people. And
Yeah.
those people carry all those other constraints coming in. So from an
Wow.
individual level to an organizational level, like that's like the first nut that has to be cracked.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you could be solutioning, but you're only from one side, or only getting one angle of it, and not
Yep.
the true opportunity at all.
I love that. And we talk about it in the sense of guiding principles. Is that a word that you use with people? Because I mean, I think that maybe here's the one difference that I can think of. Guiding principles to us are like the constraints that we actually want. We actually
Yes.
it's more of like a statement of something that we're moving towards instead of, I mean, and maybe it would be a description of something that we don't do. But
Yep.
usually if it's a negative description, like this doesn't happen here, it's actually intended to prompt the behavior to the opposite, which is something that we do want to see,
Right.
which is
Yep.
we never blame each other. Like, so then that's a negative, but it actually is something that we want to, that's a good behavior if we're
Right.
never blaming each
Yeah.
other.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, to your point, like that next step
Mhm.
I would say is like you've got to understand what the constructs of constraints are so that your
Mhm.
team, and even if you look at it as an individual, like what are the agreements then that we all have,
Yes.
right? Like,
Yes.
and I guess like the easiest example, maybe even just individually, is like, all right, like we likely have some thoughts and behaviors on how we should be, from our
Right.
parents or our family or where we got schooled,
Definitely.
that kind of stuff. And then once you recognize what the constructs of the constraints are, that next step has to be that you transfer them to an agreement. Like, so which ones do I want to keep? So to your point, maybe they're the guiding principles. Like, which ones
Mhm.
do I want to keep, and which ones do I recognize were actually someone else's? And I'm going to park them to the side, because if you kept bringing them along without doing that division, without first seeing that it was a constraint and then recognizing which ones you wanted to keep, you'll be living a life that's somebody else's. So on the organizational level,
Yeah.
your employees will be operating on a different pathway than what you may have intended them to do. So that's why you
Yes.
have to separate them out and then convert them all to agreements.
Yeah, that is 100%. We think the first step to any really successful team development initiative, because if you don't take the time to set out what it is we're actually working towards to do, then you're going to be aimless and you're going to unintentionally bring in some of these negative things that we actually don't want.
Yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
so that's why we always are saying too that the guiding principles are a living document. They are never finished. They have to evolve as the company and the team does, because something that got you here might not get you there. So they have to be refreshed continually. And so we're trying to avoid that unconscious agreement and bring things
Yes.
more to the surface, because I think and it's so good there. I mean, I don't know if you ever read the book The Four Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz.
Mm,
uh,
mm-mm,
it's a really interesting book, and it's really a spiritual development book.
mm,
But
mm-hmm.
that's one of the things that he talks about in that book, is he talks about how nothing can enter your mind without you first agreeing with it. And so he talks about how there's all these like societies, like everything is a dream, because he's a very spiritual man. So he's talking about this
Yeah.
all like in the context of what it means to be a human on Earth. And
Mm,
one of the things is he's like, there's it's just a big dream. And we have society's dream, we have the dream of the planet, which is comprised of all
mm,
these people living their life, and it has all these rules. And so part of this, and you're indoctrinated as a child into believing the things that your society taught you. So there's all these, that's so interesting, and it's all about unraveling. And I think a big part of where I feel like I'm grateful to be working with you on this mission and with this message is that we're trying to unravel a lot of this stuff. It feels like a lot of the times.
yeah.
And yeah, and it's ushering in a new way and really showing that this way can be just as productive and uh, create amazing results too.
Yeah. Yeah. And I do take a lot of inspiration from just watching how kids interact. Like
Mhm.
when you think of how they can put judgment quickly aside, like especially when they're young. But yes, to the point of your book, that book you mentioned, there
Yeah.
are, as we grow up, more layers that happen. But when you look at like toddler age, like all the questions they're free to ask, that for parents sometimes feel like we're drowning. But I often say to folks, like, if you actually turn those questions inside, like, oh, why am I acting like that? How, what, like,
Mhm.
you actually start feeling that water disappear. You don't, then you start identifying what those constraints might be for you to turn them
Mhm.
into, like, all right, what am I really going to agree into and
Yep.
drive my life in this way, so I don't feel like I'm living a life that somebody else's, or I'm doing something that is like unenergizing, it's draining and not, the other way. So that's where we can help people thrive, in essence, like through
Yeah.
considering embracing that, like, yes, it should continually change as you get new inputs, but having something there that's agreed upon within the organization
Yep.
is important. But I think on top of that too, you need the infrastructure, like, to support
Totally.
those behaviors, because like there are those, I think we mentioned earlier, I can't remember if it was before we started recording or after, but like
Yeah.
those like micro
Totally.
moments of behaviors that give signals to employees of what
Uh-huh.
constraints exist,
Yeah.
right? And I think you need the infrastructure, and that is like, all right, whether it be a process of how we're going to do things, or like
Mhm.
um it needs to be baked in with frequency too, so that you can rewire things so everybody knows, and like knows how to integrate this, like
Yep.
otherwise it's principles that might stay on a wall, that
Mhm.
don't get fully practiced and embedded. Like, that's, you need that infrastructure to help with that embedding.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't have made a better pitch for what our software does at gomobi.org. But that's besides the point. And one of the things that I wanted to just bring, we were talking about before we started recording, and I think it ties into this nicely, is you were mentioning structures and frequency and things like this. And one of the things that I know you've thought about a lot is how to help somebody grow through feedback. So I wanted to know, like, we were talking a little bit about this before, but in your mind, like, how would you bring a play approach to feedback, and what would that look like for organizations to be more effective in helping somebody grow by
Hmm.
thinking about it like that?
Yeah, I think when we think of feedback, we've all probably had a spectrum of experiences.
That's
Um,
good. Well
and
said.
some okay, and some probably really bad. I I have not enough data that tells me most of them are great. And from that standpoint, on a play aspect, it's still serious. Like feedback is still serious. But when I think about neuroscience of play and what that really means, like inviting some true, genuine curiosity within that feedback loop of just trying to understand, like, first we need some foundation in what we're saying we need. Like, does it fit with the principles? There are
Mhm.
competencies, but those are
Yeah,
very like specific role based. Um,
exactly.
and not, we don't see those competency bases flushed out or present all the time. And I think
That's right.
that's
Mhm.
like a miss. That's like saying, when I think of like uh I can't think of a good play example right now for that one, but like that's
Mhm.
like, you really, you can't, then how are you supposed to expect somebody to evaluate somebody else on a competency that we haven't actually agreed upon is
Right, right,
important,
right.
and to what
Mhm.
level? And I think when we think about how we construct feedback as
Mhm.
managers and execs, leaning into that, when routing back to like the curiosity side, like
Yes.
why do we actually need this, or what are we really trying to evaluate on, and where do we need growth? Like with any company there's some growth pathway, like where else do we need them or want them to grow into? It could be a point of discussion though. Like it's not
Right.
just like, all right, like we're gonna push them there. Like it should be, and they shouldn't feel like they have to take it either. I think it
Yeah.
goes back to a little bit of like, how can we match areas that they thrive in with what the business needs, and finding
Yep.
that there's like this Japanese term like ikigai. It's
Yeah.
like, finding that direct balance with like what the world needs, what your work needs, what you need. Like if we can put some
Mhm.
conscious effort to it, like there is this approach where many sides can win. It's not just either the employee gets it or the company benefits. Like there can be some mutual aspect of it that is not just income, or it's not just
Yes.
this dollar amount. I think to me personally, and as I've had other conversations with executives, that
Yeah.
has been informed this thought is, COVID really shook everybody up, and
Mhm.
that lack of control, just, it may have been other personal stuff going on too. It woke up everybody. In the last few years, we've been recovering from it, and since that recovery time, we've all surfaced out again with a lot of folks saying like, "What am I doing here? What's going on?"
Mhm.
And almost like waking up, and they're experiencing some curiosity, within these questions. Like I'm sure kids would do it all the time, like, well, what, why am I doing this? Like I'm gonna go do that instead. Like, or I'm gonna go ask somebody. If I don't know this, I'm just gonna go ask somebody, right? And I
Right.
think there's some aspects of that that's starting to pop up. And I do want to be a force of nature to like help empower folks to try, like, again, like tap into the kid inside you, tap into the kids you might see playing in the mud, and you're like afraid. Like, why are you afraid? What's the worst that can happen? You're just gonna get dirty, right? But
Yeah.
like, try and be supporting in that nature. So that's what I'm excited. Like we always talk about stuff like this, like that's what we're trying to do. So
I know, and I love that. And what you like, one of the things that kind of came, like, there's a connection happening for me, which is that really like when you're a kid, you don't think about asking somebody for input. Like you would go and be like, "Is this right?" Like I just legitimately am like when you're like you think about a little child, like I envision it, like being like, "What do you like? Is this like what do you think of this?" And would you like that's the whole thing about feedback, like you want to like that in itself is an engaging in play with the other with the child,
hmm
because you don't want to be like you're not telling them like, oh, you could do this better and it would make you better. You're telling them like, oh, here's just one other way you might think about it, like
hmm
here's one other thing you could try just because it's good to try, and maybe I know that it works well because I'm an adult and I know and I've done this kind of thing before that is helpful. um, but I think we lose some of that in some of these contexts of really trying to do things by the book or trying to do things the right way. And there's a time and a place for a lot of that, and these structures need to exist. But unfortunately, a lot of the structures that do exist, they just aren't very helpful because they don't really help people do the inquiry that you're talking about. They
Mm-hmm.
don't help people. We were talking before we got on too about the single loop versus double loop learning, which if you are watching this and you are curious to know what that means, go back and watch our previous talk on espoused versus enacted theories of action in organizations. Very nerdy subject line, but a really, really actually practical and helpful talk, which is what we're all about. So in this, we were talking about single loop learning, and Elaine was sharing an example of a situation she encountered with a client, and they were trying to figure something out, and they were asking the 5 whys, which you were saying from consulting background. Why did this happen? Okay, then like going down, but you're basically just triaging like one specific thing with that. And you're not, and the most effective questions that we find for actual learning, which is where we're calling double loop learning, because you can single loop learn and say, okay, this is why this happened. Now we get it. Very good. We learned why this thing happened, but you didn't learn what contributed to it or always, or what did we miss that led this thing to happen. So that's when we say double loop learning is like,
Yeah.
instead of saying, what could we do to double our sales? You could say, and that's a single loop learning. Like, what could we do? Like, okay, well, we could go and hire a consultant and we could get our sales process revamped. We could do all this stuff. But if you're thinking about instead, a double loop learning question would be, what is getting in the way of our sales being twice as high? That is a totally different question and will beget a totally different answer.
Mm-hmm.
What is preventing us from selling 3 times as much as we are right now?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. And I think of like how kids
way
ask
different.
questions, and I know
Huh?
we touched on like, yeah, it's the 5 whys, but kids, if you really kind of put that play framework in and like how their brains are wired, it wouldn't just be that straight line why. It would be like, well, what happened or how or what if, I wonder if, like there'd be a lot of those insertions in between where you would find that it's not just the why. I think we started with an example of like, that customer had a poor customer experience, and then you might
Yeah,
go to why,
exactly.
like, oh, they had to wait 2 hours, oh, why, da, da, da. But at that first why, another question is like, well, why was that 2 hours meaningful to that customer? It's like kind of that flip, that you're talking, and that's how we got to like the double loop and single loop side of it. So I think the different ways to ask the questions, are just as important, and listening into like what other facets have we not asked about or uncovered, especially in that discovery side is part of the exploration. And again, like play foundation side, like you're
Yeah.
exploring, you're asking to understand, and having that genuine curiosity at however many levels it takes. Like I still remember my kids, like, um, they were walking in San Francisco and they decided just to lay down on the ground. Great. Um, that, yeah. Besides
Oh
the, oh
boy.
my God, it's a dirty ground, but okay.
Yeah.
But they were looking up at a bird, and they like had to finish all their questions of how is that bird taking flight. And so it's like that level of genuine curiosity that when we think about performance levels and performance reviews and, teamwork and things like that, I think it's really critical to understand the circumstances in the environment, to take a pause and want to understand your team's constructs of constraints so that you can remove the ones that you have control over as an executive and
Right.
support the other ones through how you can. I mean, that truly is like servant leadership.
Yep.
And I think that I'd love to see more and more of that.
Yeah, us too. What would you say is something that we were talking a little bit about micro moments and creating psychological safety? What would you say for somebody that wants to do this and be the leader? Maybe their entire organization isn't quite on board with this yet, but they're listening to this and really getting excited about it. What would you say to that person?
On what first to do. I think
Yeah.
even starting with some of the base elements that we talked about, of like leaning into like what is the curiosity, of course, like leaning first into that curiosity, but like what's then constraining them now, really,
Yeah.
like, um and there are some things to be that are much larger than an individual can manage, but like to be able to ask like, well, what's stopping you from at least like exuding that part of it, like that part of the change, and individually looking through your own constructs of constraints, sharing that thinking, and creating environments for that type of exploration. So if you are in that leadership position, when we think about innovation and collaboration, like you don't want to just say, here are the agreements, like have the team get to that construct of agreement first, like got to
Yes.
get to that. You can't just say it is. And then after that, having those moments that it's practice, like you as a leader need to show up and do that.
Yep.
Some
Yep.
level of like vulnerability to that extent, and
Yeah.
celebrating those moves versus, I can't tell you how many times I still hear like celebration of like how someone worked extra on the weekend to get something done. And we should actually be celebrating that kind of like, hey, we actually created a safe environment for people to try stuff, and it got messed up, yeah, but we put enough of a sandbox where there's like no real
Yes.
damage, but we enabled people to test their skills, to lean into it. Like there's all that, again, like thinking of like how the brain develops, and like we're rewiring experimentation. We need to include more of that, because as
Hmm.
the world's problems get more complex, the technology is always changing. New inputs
Yeah.
always have to be re-entered into our own brain system, and we can't be doing things the same way and think a different outcome is going to happen. So
Yeah. Yeah.
so that would be, to rewind back, that would be like the first thing, is like that it's still around like what's constraining now, and what do you want to agree on moving forward individually, and then within your own pocketed team, like if you have a smaller
Yeah.
team. And I know showing that, you'll see dividends from that, and then like as other teams observe, like how did you get that done. And I think definitely in more hybrid environments, it's even more critical to be
Yeah.
having very clear,
Yep.
like you said, principles, like the guiding principles locked in.
Teamwork strategies. That's what that is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then also understanding like ways of working, which I for me, it's like it's play styles. Like what are our best ways of working, our thrive areas, like where and how do we need to be and do in order to like create ideas or share ideas. We actually have all different ways. Some of us might be extroverted thinkers but introverted like deliverers. So those are things that, without keeping in tune to, you actually miss out on a lot of like inclusion of other people's thoughts, as leaders. Like we can easily do that if we are not aware of it.
Yeah. I that's such good advice. The thing that the vulnerability is so important to all that you just said. And to be the one, especially as the person in charge, to then say, this is what we're doing. And I think that, here are some ways that I acknowledge that we're not perfect. You probably have thought of a bunch more. I want to know about them because I want to also decide what we would rather do and move towards that and do that together because I care about this. And
Yeah.
it reflects, like, I take it seriously if there's something that's not going as well as we all would want it to be. And that's the responsibility. That is servant leadership. That is the perfect word. I love it. Gosh, so many things going through my head right now, Elaine. Um, what else should we know about adopting play into our work in our lives?
I think there's so many facets we can't cover in in this particular session, but
Yeah,
definitely when we think of play, innovation, and in the workplace, there's the three areas of really like, you got to get those constructs of constraints out of the way. It's kind of like, if you want to like build a train track, you got to clear the field a little bit. So you got to get to those, and you got to agree like what direction. So right, like the little guiding principles that we talked about. You do need to build that infrastructure in order to do it. But before you can build the infrastructure, you need the collaboration. So
that's
like
right.
if you can't be talking through it and in the collaborative moments, and I know we'll talk about it later, but like different things that we can think about in order to ignite that true collaboration, not just like, okay, now we have to sit in a room and like talk about things.
Right.
That's not what we're talking about. So
Yeah, we're talking about a whole different operating idea of
Yeah.
what we're doing.
And maybe
Yeah.
it's like, actually, now you made me think of when you said operating idea, it's like a new operating system for
Yeah.
an organization to pull in and embody these elements.
I was talking at a startup event last night with a gentleman who was a CEO of a large customer support
Hmm.
business. And we were talking about how, and they, obviously we're super focused on performance development, and in customer service businesses where it's an outsourced, they have a call center, a customer support center, um, 12,000 employees.
Mm.
And they were saying that the number one thing that set them apart and made them the number one partner for American Express, like all these huge blue chip brands, and they were recognized as like the leader in this, was that they always focused on the behaviors. They never focused on, oh, like here's one little thing that you could have done better on this call. They were like, this is how we want you to show up when you answer the phone for somebody that's calling for our help, or when you go into a sales
Right.
conversation.
Mm-hmm.
This is the way this is the ideal way you could show up. And he's like, when we started doing this, and the thing that I thought was very validating was, he said, when we started to track it, like they had built their own proprietary software.
Mm.
When they used a platform to actually track some of this stuff, he's like, our metrics went through the roof,
Mm.
and our competitors were like left in the dust because
Mm-hmm.
we figured out a way to help people focus on the behaviors that matter. And then we just tripled down on it, and we just
Mm-hmm.
made sure that every single one of our conversations was about the behaviors. And
Mm-hmm.
all this, it always comes back to that. And I could not agree more.
Yeah. Well, it's right there. It's like rewiring. Like you do need that infrastructure to help support an organization, like rewiring in order to focus
Exactly.
on that. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great.
I love it, Elaine. Well, maybe in our next session, which we will
Yeah.
be having next week, we could talk a little bit more about that, because like you said, this is just, it could go on for forever and ever, which
Yeah.
is
Sounds
so.
good.
Yeah, Elaine, where can people find you if they want to get in touch about your work?
Yeah, you can email me at hello@myplaytype.com, and happy to talk to you more. We're starting to venture into a new consulting side of things to help organizations solve hard problems through the neuroscience of play, and we're called Hello Joy. So we'll make that live shortly.
Wow, very cool, Elaine. I'll look forward to hearing more about
Thanks.
that.
Yeah.
Yes, and if you are listening to this on LinkedIn, give Elaine a follow. She shares great stuff all the time. I love seeing Elaine in my feed. And if you are on our watching this via our email list, thank you for being here. We'll have Elaine back next week, also. So we're very excited for that, and a lot more coming up. So thanks for being here, Elaine, and thanks for being here, everyone.
Thanks, Wade.
Okay, see you next week.